This is WeatherBrains episode number 692, the pre-show. This is for April 22nd, 2019. Getting set to have a good show tonight. I feel it in my bones. But for those that don't know, the pre-show, this is the part of the show where we do three things. We share boring personal stories, humorous anecdotes, and occasionally say very, very outrageous things. So let's see if I can actually hear Kevin for the first time tonight. Talk. Hear you breathe. It's working. I opened up the show with Chrome tonight. So we had for the past couple of Monday nights, I could not hear anybody. And I had to go to the Chrome browser to hear it. So it's working. So Kev, I can hear you. You are scratching, picking, making noises there.
Picking and a grinning?
Picking and a grinning, man. Let's see if I can get Harold on here and Vic.
You got me on the Yeti?
Yeah, sounds great. Sounds great. All right, there's Harold. I see his picture on there.
I'm in the middle of trying to get an 8-hour-old weather story pinned off of the top of our website.
Oh, that happened.
It's KFDX.
Okay. We'll just leave it there.
I came to work 5 years ago. That's how it happened.
Yeah.
Another good day at work, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, baby. Ask me what happened with the crawl.
No. Oh, I can't wait to hear this story.
No, I can't.
You can.
It's
the pre-show.
Let's just say it wasn't what was supposed to have happened.
Uh-oh. Was it crawling something other than the forecast?
After two people, including myself, described what was supposed to happen, literally 10 minutes later, the wrong thing happened and continued for a half an hour.
Ooh.
Oh, wow. A half hour. That's exciting.
No, it's not.
Is that
Is this why you have duct tape wrapped around your head so your head won't explode?
Yes, and it doesn't work.
Hey, if there are people who liked it, maybe it could become a new feature, you know?
I'm just taking it one day at a time.
One of those days.
No, they're all that way.
Oh, the infinite Monday.
Not.
Huh?
You have good days, Kevin. You have good days.
No, you have not been. You have not been here.
Wow. And for those bosses of Kevin, he didn't say that. He's just joking. This conversation never took place.
This is a cozy fireside chat.
You know what's weird? When I get on the when I have to open up the Hangouts, I get on the YouTube page for this channel, and it tells you the show with the most number of views today. Guess what the most number of views we had today, April 22nd, episode 404.
Really?
Yeah. People have been drawn to that show and still are. And for those that don't know, that was the Mike Morgan episode when he was our guest. And
I heard some very interesting things about him lately.
Ooh, tell us. It's only the pre-show.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's just us girls listening.
It's just us girls talking.
No, I can't.
I still don't understand those tornado forecast tweets that he does.
What is he? What's the content in them?
It's like plus minus F1 with Becky DePodwin retweeted something, and she was like, "I have so many questions," but then it had like F2 strength. It was very.
I thought we flipped to the EF scale about 12 years ago, didn't we?
That was everywhere except Oklahoma City.
Okay. We'll ask Dr. Brooks when here, we get we get Harold and Vic and Kim on this show, there's going to be so much brain power. It's going to be staggering. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to invite them by email because they're not responding to the traditional method here. So I am going to send them the super private link and make it happen that way.
Cool.
Because I know it's them because when I invited them, their picture showed up.
Mm-hmm. We did a test today with those addresses, and it was good. But you know how
right.
Inverse proportional relationship between success and intelligence of guests.
And once again, I was first in.
That's right. Kevin and I came right on the show with no problem, so it shows you where we stand here. Our IQs are probably under 50 here, like Brick Tamlin.
Oh, I'm sharing. There's the graphic. So,
oh my goodness.
Plus minus F1, but have plus minus F2 tornado. I don't understand.
Let me try and process this. And what do the colors mean? You got dark red and brighter red
with no legend.
Right. So peak tornado strength is F1 plus minus. So
or are they trying to say that it's like peak, like you expect F1, but then F2 it's like sustained winds and gusts or something. Like could be as high as F2 plus minus.
Right. So but
then plus F2 would be F3.
but
and F1
plus how many?
Would be F2.
Yeah. I mean, Vic, help us out, man. What does this graphic mean?
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, loud and clear. So we're not we're going to pull you into this cesspool here.
Oh, I tell you what, I saw that, and sometimes you just do this, and that's it. And that's it. You don't even comment. You just leave it alone.
I'm not going to say anything because I don't want his news director to call my boss again.
Helicity Designs, after the first graphic that came out a couple years ago, and I think a lot of people had questions. Helicity Designs had a shirt with their tornado icon, and it just said plus minus F3. And I bought it because I thought it was hilarious. And I think I'm the only person that may have bought it, but I just think it's hilarious.
Little did you know it would become reality.
I laugh every time. I just think it's the funniest thing. Just
who are these people behind the Helicity shirts and all that? Do we know who they are?
Isn't it Phil from Stormfront Freaks?
I don't know.
Don't think so.
I thought it was. Maybe I'm incorrect.
We need to get him on the show, whoever it is, unless it's some super secret deal. I mean,
I want to know who runs the Podunk NWS Twitter account.
That's a good one. That is funny. I mean, you got to admit that Twitter account is funny. Anytime I see that, I jump right to it. So Harold's not on here. He put out a tweet. He sounded cranky. He said, "This is past my bedtime."
Well, we had a dissertation defense today, Harold and I. Congratulations. If she gets to listen to this, congratulations to Marina Molina, who is newly minted doctor from Central Michigan University under the direction of Dr. John Allen. And Harold and I were on that committee, and she did a fantastic job. So congratulations to her.
Awesome.
Yes, Harold's tweets is fair warning. You're keeping me up past my bedtime.
Oh, he can deal with it every once in a while.
I've got underwear older than Harold. Come on, here he comes.
I was sitting here with the other thing, and just nothing was happening. So I'm back.
So when do you normally go to bed, Harold?
Yeah, that's about right. It's pretty dang close.
Well, we better get this thing started quick. We have to wait until the bottom of the hour because the television joins us then. So we have to wait for 3 minutes and 30 seconds. So
got it.
We can sit here. We can gossip for 3 minutes and 30 seconds before we hit the record button here.
Oh, we've been gossiping.
Well, we've been gossiping big time.
Harold had the early bird special down at the cafeteria at 4:30, and now he's ready for bed.
No. Actually, found out at about 5:30 that there was a local restaurant that was doing free meals all day for teachers, and so my wife and I went there.
Nice.
So, never
That's
being afraid of
awesome.
never being afraid of a free meal.
And what do you present to prove that, or are you just known everywhere?
I know it wasn't me. My wife got the free meal. I paid for mine, but they actually didn't even make her show her ID, so it was it worked out. But
she just looks like a teacher.
It was kind of weird looking around the restaurant. Nobody was a surprise.
Almost a show title.
Yes.
Yep. All right, John, give us some helium there. Talk to us.
Yes.
It's helium.
Say fender bender.
Yeah. Bender. Harold and Vic, John has a little issue with his computer setup there, and he sounds like he's been sucking helium when he first joins us.
Oh, very good.
And he sends it a reboot, and he's normal. So, Kevin, we have more PhDs on this show than I think we've ever had. The brain power, this thing might explode here. So
that's a very good point.
You got 3 lowly practitioners here, and that's it. So we're just going to sit back and.
I'm afraid to say anything.
Yeah, I'm
never.
I believe that.
Yeah, we know that's not true.
We know better.
Where's that email, Aubrey? Somebody said more accelerant, and I'm just too. I'm too old anymore. I think Troy is taking over the accelerant.
Yeah, it might be.
Yeah, I think that it's time to pass the torch.
No. He's learning from you. You're the best.
Well, he knows.
All right, John, can we hear you?
Okay, how am I doing now?
Try again.
Actually, that didn't sound good. That was a shot. So try it again, John.
ABC testing. 1, 2, 3.
It's kind of overmodulated.
That's better. It sounds a little hot, but it was better the second time. Are you on the
helium?
What? It sounded fine. So talk again, John. You sounded fine that time.
How am I doing now? Step back a little bit.
Yeah,
perfect. That's exactly what you need to do right there. We're good.
Hold one hand up and the other one down, and put on your tinfoil hat, and then we'll get you in there. Okay.
And do the hokey pokey.
I need a new computer. That's what I need.
Yeah. I'm in there with you, John. I've got my 2012 clunker here.
Yeah, it's about me.
So it's all right. So we're going 5 seconds out. We're going to welcome our television people. The recorders are rolling, and we'll get this sucker going. And welcome to those watching on the television side. You know what this is? It's Monday night. It's WeatherBrains time. So we're actually going to start on time for a change. It's a shock. So here we go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey, this is WeatherBrains episode number 692. This is the weekly show all about weather. This is for April 22nd, 2019. Very excited about tonight's show. I've got all kind of questions for our guests. But first off, it's always good to see Kevin Selly, better known as the Accelerant. And man, was he cranky in the pre-show.
No.
You are in rare crank form tonight, baby.
Oh, maybe that's because, we were talking about me passing the torch, pun intended, of the Accelerant on to Troy Kimmel. And so maybe I could step away and just be the Accelerant during the pre-show. How does that sound?
No.
You want to think about it?
No. You are the Accelerant. That will never change. Okay. We've got Dr. John Scala up in Pennsylvania. He survived tornadoes and everything else. John, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing well, James. Thank you. A little less amplification to the flow this evening, so we're feeling much better.
Yeah. I see it's raining up in New York City and Boston, and looks like the Red Sox got rained out tonight. But yeah, no tornadoes for a change, so that's good. Aubrey, I guess things are nice and quiet where you are and getting warmer, I assume.
Yes. Beautiful day, and what a great quiet weekend after Friday's active night. So looking forward to a much quieter week this week.
Yeah, we'll talk about that weather later, but Kim Clocko McLean, please bring in our guests. I'm excited about this show. I have many, many questions for them.
Wonderful. Well, they have many, many answers. These two are, I'm very excited to introduce tonight's guests. First, we have Dr. Harold Brooks from the National Severe Storms Laboratory, and we have Victor Gensini, who you would think, based on his paraphernalia behind him, is a Bulldogs, Georgia Bulldogs fan, but he's actually at Northern Illinois University. So thank you guys so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate having you here. So we will get into why the two of you are joint tonight on the show. So you recently authored a paper that is on a very interesting topic, but we'll get to that by talking a little bit about your backgrounds. Harold, let's start with you. I know that you've been on the show before, but for those who haven't gotten to hear you before on the show, tell us a little bit about your background and what got you into meteorology.
Well, I grew up in St. Louis, and my undergraduate degrees were in physics and math from William Jewell College just outside of Kansas City. And I kind of stumbled into meteorology. I'm not really a weather weenie. I had the chance to go on a summer undergraduate research program, and did at Columbia University in the climate modeling there. And they invited me to come back for graduate school, and I kind of stumbled around through that for a few years, and then decided that I'd get a little closer back to home, and went to the University of Illinois. And the best thing to do there was model thunderstorms numerically with Bob Wilhelmsen. Got my PhD and came down to the lab to do a postdoc for a year, and almost 29 years now that I've been here. So I'm very slow to get out. And I've done a lot of work on the where, when, and why of severe thunderstorms and tornadoes, and the evaluation of weather forecasts, and how we can hopefully create and use weather forecasts better in the future.
Harold, I gotta stop you right there. I don't think you've ever stumbled through anything. So it's
you'd be.
I'm sorry.
You didn't watch me coming into the office tonight trying to figure out how to get the computer turned back on. Apparently.
And by the way, Kim, let me just say that Harold is the Elvis of St. Louis, and I'm just going to leave it at that. Go up to the hill. Go to the hill in St. Louis.
Yeah.
Go to any restaurant.
Not any restaurant. There's some that probably don't like me, but go to Favazza's, tell them you know the Brookses, and they will take care of you.
Wow. Just mention the name, and he is the Elvis of St. Louis, and you'll know what I mean.
He's the Elvis or the Mafia?
Kevin, I may actually be able to get to this show, done with the show before bedtime if you're not careful.
Oh, zing!
We don't have any Godfather music on the soundboard, do we?
Soundboard does not have Godfather.
So, gracefully bringing that back to meteorology, since you brought up St. Louis, you claim that you're not a weather weenie, but you know quite a bit about St. Louis tornado history.
Yes,
it has an interesting one.
Yeah, I've done some stuff over the years with the kind of the very interesting history of tornadoes in St. Louis. There have been 3 exceptionally important tornadoes that went through there, but when we adjust for the wealth of the country, 2 of the 3 most damaging tornadoes in U.S. history were in St. Louis, 1896 and 1927. And for James's benefit, the 1927 tornado hit Sportsman's Park. The Browns were supposed to be having a doubleheader that day, which had gotten canceled. They actually played the next day in the middle of the rubble surrounding the stadium. With 200 fans in attendance for a doubleheader. Yeah. Wow. And then the third big tornado, middle of the night, February the 10th, 1959, took down TV antenna, took off the north end of the arena in St. Louis. The beginning of the circulation went over my parents' house. So I've got some stuff with that. Eventually, hopefully love to get a book written on that, because there are 2 of the events are extreme outliers in the climatology, which makes them interesting by themselves, and 2 of them are extremely damaging. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm very excited to have Harold on the show tonight. Now, this will transition actually to our next guest. I was an undergraduate researcher with him. I won't mention the year, but it's been a couple of years now since I was an undergraduate researcher for the summer at the Severe Storms Lab with him and Dr. Dan Sutter, an economist at OU at the time. So very special to have him, Harold, stuck with me through my graduate years and got to sign that piece of paper for my committee graduating me. So with that, I'll toss it over to Dr. Victor Gensini, who also shares a similar history. I think it was just 3 years after I was subjected to Harold's treatment of undergraduate researchers that Vic got to be one of his students too, right, Vic?
Yeah, that's right. I was a part of the first REU class. For those who don't know what the REU is, the research experience for undergrads. It's a great opportunity for undergraduate students to be involved over the course of a summer, paired up with a research scientist. And I was lucky enough to get paired up with Harold in 07. But my path in meteorology actually started this past Saturday, 15 years ago from this past Saturday, April 20th, 2004. For those who don't remember that date, that was Terrible Tuesday in the Illinois Valley. It was the Granville Utica tornado. I was sort of on a path for engineering at the time. And that event, for those of us who have seen storm damage firsthand, not just the scar, right, that it leaves on the physical landscape, but also the mental scar. I mean, for those people and many others who experience tornado damage, to them or their loved ones, it's what happened, their life right before the tornado and then after the tornado. So for me, that was sort of the changing point. I did my BS and MS at Northern Illinois under Walker Ashley, who was a guest a few weeks ago. And then the real turning point in my career, though, was that summer in 2007 in Norman with Harold, because Harold is the leading, I would say, scientist on severe storms in climatology. And that was sort of right where my interests were lying at the time. And then back wall here, PhD for University of Georgia. I taught at College of DuPage for about 5 years, and now I'm full circle back to my undergraduate institution, which is both interesting and probably a good and bad thing, but it's great to be back there and focusing a lot more of my time on research. So it's been a unique journey for me, but I'm sort of back home in the farm fields of rural Illinois.
And yes, and so I signed off on both Kim and Victor. On their PhDs. I was on their committees, and this afternoon I got to do another one. Maria Molina from Central Michigan University passed her PhD defense, so that was another good time, and always nice to see students complete that stage of their careers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, Vic, tell us a little bit about the work that you like. What's the sort of general area of research that you work in? We learned from Harold that he focuses on tornado climatology to a great extent and forecast verification. What has grown to be your niche in research?
So I started off a lot in the very same arena of severe. My master's work was on severe thunderstorm climatology, mostly looking at the environments that are favorable for thunderstorm climatology and really focusing on the U.S. And then for my dissertation, the crux of that work was severe storms and climate change, which is a question that I still get, what are tornadoes going to do in the future? What are hailstorms going to do in the future? And really try to advance that work. It's a very difficult thing because of the scales involved when we're talking about changes in global temperature, global water vapor content, jet stream functions, and then really trying to drill that down to the storm scale to say, yes, we're going to have more tornadoes or fewer tornadoes. So that's a really challenging issue. And I've done a lot of work in that arena. Right now, I've sort of put that a little bit on the back burner. It's still projects, that I'm juggling, but a lot of my focus right now is on subseasonal to seasonal variability and how that drives perhaps weather patterns across the United States that are either favorable or unfavorable for severe convective storms. So we're looking at things like the Madden-Julian oscillation, ENSO, right? Jet stream variability in the form of angular momentum. Just a lot of these teleconnections that we know kind of all play in concert together, and they can certainly drive months like April 2011. And that was really the crux of this research. Started out, the motivation there was April 2011 and the devastating events across the southeastern United States. And the question then becomes, why are some Aprils like 2011 and why are other Aprils like 2013? or so what are the major drivers there? And that's really where I think a lot of our field is moving right now in the forecasting realm, trying to we know where deterministic prediction ends. It ends with Ed Lorenz at day 12, day 14. But can we take some of that information, that dynamical information from our models, and then maybe feed it into statistical models that can then give us sort of an edge with things like machine learning and analog methods and so on to help drive prediction into that we really call subseasonal 2 weeks to 2 months. And that's really where, as an emergency manager or whatever, it's not going to benefit everybody. And if you don't know how to consume the information, obviously, Kim, as you know well, it's not going to assist anybody. And so that's really where my research is at right now.
Yeah, it's so interesting. A lot of your work revolves around ideas about change. So you're talking about in the next couple of weeks, how are things going to be changing? And then this work with Harold, you're talking about a sort of a longer time horizon where you've been looking back on the tornado climatology and trying to talk about how it's been changing. Now to get into that, Harold, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the tornado database. Because if you're going to do this research and try to map what is changing, you have to understand, well, how good is the data that we're relying on? What are some of the things that you can use the data set for and some of its limitations?
Well, it's important to remember when we start looking at the tornado database that's officially collected is that it's not collected for the purposes of creating a good climatological data set. This isn't like you stick a thermometer out and look at it every day and come back after 100 years and a lot, or a rain gauge. This depends upon people observing the event, reporting the event, and getting into the system, because the reports are generally collected to evaluate tornado warnings. They aren't there to make a climatology, so we have to be pretty careful about what's in there. And we have information that's pretty good in it. We're usually pretty close to the time that the tornado occurred. That may be off by a few minutes, but that's at least in the ballpark. We know that yes or no, the tornado occurred for the most part. Where it occurred, again, relatively close. We have some ideas about the intensity of the tornado, and it's starting to look, as we look more and more in the details at it, that if we look for tornadoes that are at least F1 or EF1 in intensity over the years, that those have been relatively consistently reported. There are some issues with when the tornadoes are stronger than that. They may have been overrated or underrated at various time periods, but the F1 and greater cutoff looks to be pretty consistent. That's about 500 of those every year. Then we get down to other things like the death tolls and the injury tolls. The death tolls are probably better than the injury tolls because we pay attention to those things more. And then the path length and width data. The path length data is probably better quality than the width data. The width data has a lot of issues with it. You have to be very careful with how you use it. And so we try to figure out what the highest quality stuff is. And that's probably yes or no, the tornado was F1 and greater in intensity, where it occurred, and relatively close to what time of day it occurred. And those are the things we have the most confidence in, going back probably to either 1953 or 1954, depending upon what you believe. There's a little issue that 1953 was probably a very big year, and so it's not clear that the numbers are completely good there. But by 1954, it looks like we were starting to collect the data close to when the events happened, and so they're relatively reliably collected.
That's really good information. The really interesting point you raised, that there were different points in time where tornadoes appear over or underrated. Can you describe what was going on?
Sure. Yeah. The National Weather Service adopted the Fujita scale for estimating damage as sort of a trial basis, and then around the Weather Service between 1975 and 1977. And they had all these tornado reports back to 1950 that they had started collecting in some reasonable way that had no damage ratings with them. And so somebody decided, well, we need to rate them. And if you want to do that kind of a project and you don't have much of a budget, you hire undergraduates and you give them the text descriptions of the damage, and you tell them to rate the tornadoes. And the default rating they were given was F2, and they were supposed to decide if it was at least F2 or not and change from that. And when I say they had the text description, it had things like house destroyed, with no evident information about, if this was a house built with steel reinforcing bars all the way through it, or if it was, something that would have fallen over if you would have pushed on it. And it appears when we look at the distribution of the tornadoes by intensity and some other things, that those tornadoes from the 1950s up until that time, so 1978, were probably overrated. They were pretty good at F1 and higher, saying yes, but then once they made that decision, they were just overrated by about half an F scale. There's another short period of time when in the early 2000s, when it's likely that the strongest tornadoes were underrated in intensity compared to the period before and after. And it's important to know that we don't actually know what truth is. This is just relative to other time periods. The 1990s were really consistently reported and rated. It appears that it was as part of the introduction of Doppler radar, and the training program that took place with that. The Weather Service produced a guide to doing convective windstorm damage surveys that Bill Bunting and Brian Smith wrote. And it appears that as part of that training, everybody went through that book, and they seem to have done relatively consistent reporting with it. And then as things aged off from that changed, and we now have, with the EF scale coming in February of 2007, it seems that we're probably back to being consistent internally within that time, but I'm not completely sure how to compare it to pre-2007.
So really interesting you raised that point. You don't know necessarily how to compare these different periods where things were rated in different ways. I think it's really important to know the story of how these data were recorded and estimates made, because there are people who are trying to go back into the history and demonstrate trends in severity over time as well. And it's sort of important to understand, I think, some of these great limitations. And so when you were talking about earlier, wanting to hone in on some of the items of quality, what is it you can really seize upon? Would you necessarily recommend looking at that parameter, or maybe not?
It's really hard to look at the intensity. I think we can say some things if we look at essentially the gradient of intensity. So how many F3s per F2 are there? How many F4s per F3? That may be something that gives us something, but it's still really, really hard. I mean, in general, damage is hard because you could have a really intense tornado that doesn't hit anything, and so it's hard to make a rating on that. And that even beyond that, reasonable damage surveying, people doing damage surveys can disagree somewhat on what they estimate the intensity to be from the same piece of damage, and it's hard in part because the things we really care about, sort of F3 and higher, are relatively rare events. And so if you change one or two of them, the distribution seems to change. So it's just it's a hard problem.
Sure. John, I think, was interested in possibly following up on you raised the EF scale. John, did you want to follow up with Harold on anything to do with that advancement?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Harold, as you mentioned, the EF scale coming in 2007 was a nice improvement over Fujita's original efforts, because it considered damage indicators and degrees of damage within those indicators. A nice improvement, because now we could talk about how construction was used. We can take a look at power poles. We can look at hotels. Now there's a move to improve on the EF scale. I was hoping you could talk about that.
Sure. Well, there's a committee that works on this, and they are trying to come up with guidelines for the American Society of Civil Engineers that are, or for civil engineering, that can put out essentially standards and can provide this information that will help engineers do a better job of designing things. That's the ultimate goal for it. And we also started to identify things because, in some sense, because we're just paying attention more, things that are more complicated than we used to think they are, or maybe, and where we actually get less information than we used to think we did. Cars are really confusing because we now have, one of the things that's in the modern world, we have lots of surveillance cameras looking at parking lots, and sometimes you'll see one car flipped in the air, and the car next to it barely moves, and they look like they're pretty much the same vehicle. Trees are really complicated. We used to think we knew trees, and trees are. I'm glad I'm glad I don't make my money trying to estimate damage from trees, because that's just hard.
Yeah. That's it's probably going to be a thing that evolves through all of our careers. It's a challenge, and it's really I really appreciate hearing your perspective on it. Looking into the climatology, every time the method changes, it kind of changes what you're able to do. Looking back through time,
it changes what we can do, and it also changes the period of consistent record. I mean, most at one level, I want to know what truth is and what's really happening out there. But I also know that if you give me a consistently collected noisy data set, I can find a signal in it. I can pull the signal out. It's a data set that has variable quality through time. It's a lot harder to work with, but we'll just try to do what we can. It's a pardon, John. We're going to stumble through it. See if we can figure something out.
So does this mean that 40 years from now, people will look back at this time and go, yeah, that data wasn't really consistent even in the 2000 teens?
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question that we'll constantly be finding things out, because we'll probably, and we still find, even with structures that we thought we had good damage indicators on, we occasionally find that, actually, they fail slightly differently than we thought they failed when we first put the scale together. And so we'll hopefully we'll learn more, and we'll have a better picture by the time these young people are done with their careers.
One thing that I'm really looking forward to about the future of damage assessment, obviously improvement of the DIs, but really the realm of extremely high resolution commercial satellite imagery, getting down to like centimeter resolution, right? We're going to be able to do path width and length much better than we ever have in the past. And especially with even things like folks going out with throwing up drones and getting an idea very quickly on the fly of what path and width is. I think, though, that commercial satellite is probably going to be the way to go in a large, like, to really scale this up and make it consistent across all CWAs. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to the future of having swaths instead of just point and line objects in the database.
Can I bring up, since you mentioned drones, I was lucky enough to go up there to the National Weather Center and do a couple stories over the past few weeks, and I met with Phil Chilson at the, what they call it, CAS, Center for Autonomous Sensing and, what is it, Kim? Sensing and...
Probably systems.
Systems. Anyway, they're building drones. Now, you guys are talking on a little larger time frame scales and looking at climatology and whatnot, but just to recap that, because I talked about it a few weeks ago, they're going to use those drones and fly around thunderstorms and get a sampling of the environment where radars are essentially blind right now. That's got to be game-changing stuff for you guys, and we're right up on the doorstep of that. I have to go do my Fox show, so I'll hang up and listen.
I think it's a great point. One of the issues that the smaller drones typically have, unless you build these things, high capacity, if you will, is that they can't fly in the thunderstorm inflow winds. It's very hard to maintain stability and take measurements at certain locations where you want. But yeah, that will certainly, I think, alter when you're doing your inflow sampling and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Vic, last storm season, I did a damage survey for the Weather Service down in southern Lancaster County in southern Pennsylvania, and I was surveying the damage and just getting started with it. And that was a commercial property that was primarily hit, and the owner of the commercial property came up to me with a set of 8x10 glossies that he had taken of the property with his drone 12 months earlier. And he handed these to me, and he said, "Hey, I just sent my drone up this morning before you got here. So here is a set of pictures in the same place." So this, down to the foot, we can actually estimate. I'm exaggerating maybe just a little, but what the swath and the path length was. Fantastic.
Yep. Insurance companies, I'll tell you, are already doing it. So we're behind in that regard.
Wow, that's interesting. It makes a lot of sense. Well, thinking about the data set as it is, Vic, could you transition us to tell us about the project that you and Harold worked on? Because I understand that you were a good bit of the driving force for the collaboration.
Oh, yeah. So this is in regards to the paper that I think came out, Harold,
October.
Looking at the changes in spatial frequency. And of course, it was immediately labeled in the media as a shift in Tornado Alley.
Yeah, exactly.
But
that's the headline in everywhere you see it.
I know.
Headline.
That's right.
Well, if you read the original NIU news press release, it's very clear to say that Tornado Alley is not shifting. We're looking at trends. That was a really interesting research project that started sort of stumbling again. Stumbled into just making some, late night doing some analyses, putting some plots together, and sort of realized that there appeared to be a significant trend in the reports. And as we just discussed, the reports are really not enough to say much of anything. It was about a week later where I extracted all of the information out of a reanalysis data set. So looking at, for the listeners who are familiar with STP, right? James talks about this quite a bit, significant tornado parameter, which is sort of a proxy for how favorable the environment is for tornado production. And after extracting out all that information back to the late 70s, it was very clear that the environment supported the trend in the reporting. And I immediately kind of thought, well, who am I going to send this to? I knocked on Walker Ashley's door. I'm like, does this make sense? And he's like, I think so. But you probably want to contact somebody who knows a little bit more about climatology in regards to the severe. Well, and then obviously Harold, I was like, Harold, take a look at this and let me know what you think. And I don't know what your original reaction was to that, but he was like, this kid's crazy. I don't know why he's coming with me.
Harold, tell us, what was your original reaction like? What'd you do?
I think the bottom line was that I had seen people discussing report changes, and there had been this big question in my mind about, and I'd said this every time someone said something, I said, one of the things we have to be concerned about are differential changes in places and times in the way we collect the reports and the effort we put into collecting the reports, to where it may be true, but I can't tell the difference between that and and real physical changes. And so having the STP stuff in it was incredibly important, because that started to say, okay, there may still be details about the report changes that are affecting this, but having the environments change in a way that's consistent with those report changes is pretty strong evidence that something happened in the atmosphere that's different than what it used to be. And so that I was, I'm at that point in my career where I don't really need to, I don't really have to publish that much more any often if I don't really want to, without I can still keep my job. But when someone comes up and wants to publish wants me to be an author on a paper, and I don't have to do a whole lot of work other than just make suggestions of, hey, why don't you do this analysis? That's a whole lot of fun.
So basically, you got to boss Vic around a little bit.
Yeah,
I did not do any bossing. I did not do any bossing. I made suggestions. And he's good enough at coding. He could code them up and have the answer to the question in a few minutes. So
yeah. He made you an offer you couldn't refuse. That sounds great.
Yeah, a really honestly interesting story about that paper. And researchers that are out there listening to this, especially early career and graduate students, like, it faced rejection at BAMS, which is a major. We won't go into the specifics. I guess we could go into one specific. I'll throw.
Let's go into the specifics.
Just one. There was a reviewer. I will not name 1, 2, or 3, but a reviewer that said that this should not be published because he was already teaching it in his undergraduate curriculum. Okay. So again, it faced some, let's just say, interesting. Well, Harold knows. It faced some interesting contention, I think, in BAMS, and so we just, we didn't fight it. Let's just move on somewhere else. And it's that sort of peer review landscape is difficult, and it was close to being a BAMS article, and then of course. Whatever, Nature Partner Journal accepted it. That's good enough for me. In fact, that probably will end up being a bigger impact factor because it's immediately open source available for everybody to read. So Again, a lesson to everybody out there. I've had my fair share of, major revisions or denials, and you just got to kind of push through that stuff. And if you know you have good research and it's backed up by, like Harold said, the environments and a physical signal that is there, you just got to keep going for it. So.
Yeah, sure. So tell us a little bit about what you found. You've mentioned that in the press, this is reported as, Tornado Alley is changing.
Shifting.
And you're right, shifting, from one place to another. And if you look at, just the map of where you sort of color in the direction of change over space. You sort of see blues in the parts of the South Central Plains, and then reds over the southeast. And that visual cue seems to convey, it's moving over here. Tell us why that's a gross oversimplification. What does it actually mean? What did you actually find?
Exactly.
Don't tell him the answer, Kim. Don't tell him the answer when he has the question.
Honestly, I was on damage control for 2 weeks after the publication of that study. I did 60 interviews in 2 weeks, and the first sentence that came out of my mouth in every interview was, "This is not a shift. This is not a shift in Tornado Alley." And we were actually very careful not even to mention Tornado Alley in the study. If you go back and really dig through that, but. Yeah, when you look at that map, right, aesthetically, you see the cool blues and you think colder here and hotter here. And that's not necessarily the message in terms of total frequency. That's what you have to be really careful about. The colors just represent the trend lines at each point. And so we're really looking at a change, let's say in the heart of that change, which was like the Arklatex region and a little bit further east. You're talking about a change in reports of F1s of maybe 1 every 10 years. And so this is not a big change in the climate. It's statistically significant, but for a local person at a local grid scale, 1 more tornado every 10 years with an already background probability of something being so extremely low is not really something to even blink an eye at, right? But when you aggregate the change over, let's say, a county warning area or a state or a full region, those changes in probabilities actually become important for National Weather Service offices, FEMA, emergency managers, people that are assessing risk and vulnerability over a very large region. I think that is really the take-home message when you're looking at shifts. What you're really looking at just shifts in the probability function. And it's hard for people to look at that map and go, "Hey, I'm in Oklahoma City. I don't ever have to worry about tornadoes anymore." Like, that's not the right message, right? You got to be really careful about that. And I think that's probably what was portrayed, and some damage control needed to be done there. And but at the same time, if you are further east, your risk may still not be as much as it is in Dallas, Fort Worth, or Oklahoma City, but the trend there is at least for increasing threat versus where you were, say, 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah. Go ahead, Harold.
Yeah, and I'd really like to emphasize that point that it's a, okay, so you're talking about a tornado every 9 years instead of every 10 years. It isn't clear what kind of different decisions you make as a homeowner on them. But if I'm a state emergency manager and I've had a 10% increase in the number of tornadoes in my state, that affects my budget and everything else I do. And I think one of the things that we did is that I'll give Victor credit for this is you have to look at the data, you have to look at the quality data, and you have to look at it very carefully and systematically and look at all of it. The differences we're talking about, if one of the examples or the analogies I always give is, if you watch baseball, a Major League Baseball player, the difference between a 250 hitter and a 300 hitter is 1 hit a week. You watch a week of games and there's 1 hit difference between those two guys, and that's really hard to be confident that anything's happening. But that if you systematically look at all of the observations, by the end of the year, everybody agrees, hey, 300 guy hit better than the 250 guy. And that's kind of what we had to do with this is, you can't look at 1 year. You can't look at just a small part of the data. You got to look at as much data as you possibly can to be able to pull this out and to do it systematically.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the climatology is pretty low for these kinds of events. Can you give us a sense for what is the return frequency in places like Oklahoma, Alabama? What did they start with before you're talking about mapping this change?
Sure. Well, a few years ago, I tried to make an estimate of how what was the return frequency of an F2 tornado hitting my house. being the selfish person I am, that was the first place I thought of. And that number was something like, on average, once every few thousand years to actually get hit by the F2 tornado. And that, my neighbor's house across the street gets hit and I don't. That doesn't count for me. But that's a relatively low frequency of any individual point. If you look at all the points over the United States, and if you say, yeah, this place has gotten hit more than once, that's true, because essentially it's like a giant dartboard. And if I throw enough darts, I will eventually put 2 darts in the same place. And that's essentially what happens when we have these the U.S. is a large area, and eventually, the same place gets hit more than once. But that doesn't change the fact that in general, it's once every few thousand years to get hit by an F2 and greater tornado. F1 and greater, it's probably down in the once every several hundred year range.
Okay, so that is exceptionally rare, and I think, I was fascinated to learn that, because you feel so much more susceptible than that living in, I'd say, either Oklahoma or Alabama. Of these two, sort of putting these regions that you put in your paper, comparing them, I think it's a comfort to a degree to think about that way. Yeah. So you gave the values for Oklahoma. In the Southeast, what do the values tend to be there comparatively?
When I looked at it, this was based off 1921 to 1995 data set from Tom Grzoulis, and it was a little hard to put in the path length data, so it may not be quite exact. The threat in Alabama was just a little bit lower. Maybe if it was 1 in 4,000 in the middle of Oklahoma, it might have been 1 in 5,000 years in Alabama, but that's probably well within the noise of the estimates. Mm-hmm. I'm not really sure we can tell the difference between the two places very well. The thing that's always defined the plains tornado experience is that we have a very, very strong annual cycle and a very, very strong diurnal cycle. We're at the point now in Oklahoma typically where our season should be starting to ramp up, and our threat before the middle of April is pretty low. And our threat once we get to the end of June, late June, is really low, and almost all of our tornadoes happen between somewhere around 5 o'clock and 9 o'clock at night. And so that we have this really consistent signal in Oklahoma, and that's not true in most of the world.
Right. I was going to say, on the flip side of that, James, you've been already so busy this year. I think you guys have already had more tornadoes so far this year than. Okay, so that's more this year so far than you'd expect in 1 year in an average.
Right, that's more than the annual average. So we're at 53 right now.
Right.
Yeah, right. And I would say the death ridge is kind of taken over here, so it should slow down for a while. But 53, we've been shaking and baking this year.
And you get them all, and you get them over a much broader range of the day than we do around here. To me, when I look at Oklahoma, the most amazing tornado in its tornado record is November the 9th or 19th, 1930, 9 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
What the heck is that doing in Oklahoma? That is the other tornado that killed someone in a school during the school day in the state of Oklahoma history prior to the Plaza Towers tornado on May 20th, 2013. Yeah.
So what do you attribute that to, Harold and Victor? The Dixie Alley, we get more of these overnight events. Well, we're in Oklahoma. You're right. It's 4 or 5 in the afternoon until 9 o'clock at night. It's pretty consistent.
I think part of one of the big things I think that's going on is that when we get into the springtime, on average, our conditions are pretty close. We've got the Rocky Mountains giving us really good lapse rate air coming over them. Mm-hmm. We get the Gulf of Mexico providing moisture. It doesn't take a whole lot to get things going. Warm the air up during the day, and we're set to go. When you go further east to bring the ingredients together, the atmosphere has to, in some sense, work harder to bring the ingredients together. And so when you get, the large synoptic scale features working together, they just don't care that much about the time of day. And I think that's one of the things where we are, we're close enough to the Rockies that we tend not to get the really great looking low pressure systems fully formed by the time they get to us. So we care a little bit about synoptics, but not that much. Whereas synoptic scale stuff is a big, big part of what happens in the East. And I think that's also why when we get outbreaks, they tend to be bigger in the Southeast. than they are in the plains in general. Is because once the atmosphere is, in some sense, taken the trouble to work that hard to bring the ingredients together, it doesn't usually bring them together over a really tiny area. It brings them together over a large area.
Yep, I agree 100%. It's I would say the dynamical forcing for a scent would be the old, the meteorological geeky term for the day. You get forcing, weak stuff along the dry line, cap breaks, you get supercells in the Great Plains. But as you get further east and these storm systems, these cyclones wind up, they're driven by advection of that moisture off the Gulf, and you have big dynamics in play. And at that point, it's not diurnally driven anymore. It's being driven by atmospheric dynamics, and it sets up the stage for these nighttime, whether they're supercell events or QLCS events.
But it still comes down to the mesoscale. I mean, beyond the synoptics, I'm telling you guys, you know this. It's those small scale stinking boundaries.
And a lot of that determines the exact nature of where they are. But when that mesoscale stuff for you will frequently on lots of days, it's important, but it's set in the setting of the fact that we've got the really large area covering from southern Alabama up through Tennessee. That's all we got. Somewhere in there's going to be a mesoscale boundaries that are going to set up and do something that's going to cause a storm. And I think you tend to, I think, have large areas of favorable regions, probably a little bit more than we do out here.
Mm-hmm. And I can't help but feel like it's such a different experience. It has to be being a broadcast meteorologist, in the Southeast, and you have to be on the air for probably a greater portion of the day than folks in our broadcast market. James, can you tell us a little bit about, in broadcast meteorology, is this a thing? Is this known? Are there places, that broadcast meteorologists, fight to get to because it maybe is an easier coverage situation? I don't think you need sleep. I don't know that the rumor is you don't sleep. So I think you're like perfectly suited to the climatology of Alabama. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
He's a robot. That's why.
Yeah, right. I'm clearly not human. I've not slept right since 1973, and I've said that many times before, and it's true. But no, there's no doubt that it's different. I watch with great interest the Oklahoma outbreaks, and like clockwork, just like Harold and Victor are saying here. They start at 3, 4, 5 in the afternoon, and you've still got daylight, and you can see them, and they tend to wind down 8, 9 o'clock, and it's that little window. We're here. You might wind up going on the air at 8 o'clock one night, and you're still on the air at 8 o'clock the next morning with this stuff. Yeah. And they come in waves and waves, and it can be it's hard to explain, but it takes a lot of strength emotionally and physically to go through these things. You have to remain stable and be coherent when you're communicating, even if you've been up. And we had one of these deals a couple of weekends ago, not this past weekend, but the one before that. We went on the air, I think, about 10 o'clock Saturday night. We wound up getting off at 7 o'clock the next morning. And thankfully, nobody was killed in that event, in which we had a number of smaller tornadoes that night. But yeah, it's a different mindset down here in terms of the length of service when you're on that green wall. And you get used to it after a while, which is why I think it's good to see meteorologists that stay in one place for a long time, like in Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. They stay there for years and decades, and they understand the microclimates and the small scale features that have set up tornadoes in the past. And I think it's the same thing for people down here in the deep South. You just kind of need to stay and learn, and you never, ever, ever know enough. I've learned that. That's why I'm glad to have Harold and Victor on this show. You never know enough about this stuff, and you learn something every time there's a tornado event here.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about learning more stuff. Vic, you mentioned that you're helping to develop forecasts on the subseasonal timescale, so things out a couple of weeks. Tell us a little bit about what kinds of success you've had. How do you find that you're able to have skill in your forecasts? And if so, some of the things that we're talking about, these differences in forcing, does that affect the skill of the forecast? So if you've got something that could affect, say, the Great Plains under one kind of convective regime, or the Southeast, do you find that you have more or less skill with different kinds of severe setups?
Great question. So we've been issuing these forecasts for weeks 2 and 3, just looking at whether or not the country as a whole is going to be average, below average, or above average. That equates to about over March, April, May, forecasting once a week. We volunteer and do this on Sunday evening, about 80 plus forecasts for week 2. And out of those 80 forecasts for week 2, we've hit about 60 of them. Random chance, just 1/3 of that, right? 33%. So we're showing skill in week 2. Week 3, we're down to about 40 to 50%. So not a great improvement over random chance, but there's still an improvement. We're going to need a much larger sample size to really tell how skillful that is. But we're really honestly looking for what we call forecasts of opportunity. In other words, there are regimes that are very predictable, even at week 2. When you have strong Madden-Julian oscillation signal, which is basically just looking at the propagation of convection from the Indian Ocean across the maritime continent. What generally happens, we're actually undergoing one of these right now. There's a really big flare that just really started in the last 2 or 3 days over the Indian Ocean. And what that'll essentially do, as that convection hits the tropopause and goes poleward, it'll conserve its angular momentum and really strengthen the jet streams, both in the northern and southern hemisphere. And we'll start to see a response at what we call angular momentum. The jet streams will kind of just go on steroids for a little while. And what we're really looking for is what we call a jet extension, which is a really big east to west oriented ribbon, fast wind ribbon across the Pacific Ocean, what we call the North Pacific Jet. And that really gets so elongated and so unstable, and there's so much positive angular momentum. In other words, the atmosphere is rotating very fast in the east-west direction that it will break down. And usually what happens is a trough comes into the western United States. Now, that's not enough to forecast a tornado, right? But usually when you have troughs in the west this time of the year, you get southerly, southwesterly flow out over the Great Plains, you get poleward moisture advection, and it sort of sets the synoptic stage for severe storms. It all, the tornadoes obviously come down to the mesoscale, warm fronts, dry lines, cold fronts, etc. But we're really trying to find, some of the fingerprints of what we call the subseasonal climate variability. And we think that the Indian Ocean plays a big role. Tracking the Madden-Julian oscillation plays a big role. And we need a lot more research in this area, where a lot of us are really just starting to scratch the surface of this problem. But and there's not all regimes are predictable, by the way. There's sometimes when the Madden-Julian, there's no convection, and we have literally no predictability. But there are, again, stages like what we're in right now, or we're going into, where we think there are forecasts of opportunity for weeks 3 and 4, at least to say, large-scale patterns of, hey, everybody, look out in week 3. There is probably going to be conditions that are favorable for severe storms again. And we're also really good at saying when things are not going to happen. We're actually probably better at saying things are going to be quiet than precisely when that extension collapse in subsequent severe weather is actually going to occur. So
hey, is this product available publicly, Victor?
It is, yeah. If you Google ERTAF, Extended Range Tornado Activity Forecast, we've been doing about 5 years. We have all of our verification data up there, and you can get an idea. We're looking at conditions that are going to be very confined to the Gulf Coast states and Southern Plains in week 2. And then we think by week 3, week 4, we're going to have one of these forecasts of opportunity. The Madden-Julian oscillation, like I mentioned, convection is really getting going the last 3 days in the Indian Ocean. And the forecast for that is to really propagate across the maritime continent, and that should cause a jet extension and then a subsequent collapse. You'll never see this in the dynamic models, by the way, right? Because GFS ends at day 14, 15, I guess day 16 now, 384. And the CFS, which is a coupled model, still really struggles in forecasting things like the MJO. So you really don't even worry about the dynamical prediction at this point. You're really looking for the large-scale global circulation signals that through previous research, or at least appear to be through previous research, important players in these events. So if that makes sense, I don't, it's really a very young, very green preliminary research project, but we hope to partner with folks. So I'm on the seasonal severe weather forecast team for the CPC and SPC. I represent one of the academic partners in this, and we'll see where it goes. We're searching for funding for this kind of stuff, but you could imagine insurance companies are interested in stuff like this, emergency managers and so on. And it's not just severe weather activity. I mean, people are really interested for hurricane forecasting, extreme drought, fire weather, et cetera. What are these major weather and climate features that are driving the extremes on the mesoscale? And that's a tough thing because you're linking a lot of different time and space scales. But we think it can be done, especially now with the addition of massive parallel computing. That's my biggest, I wouldn't be able to do a lot of my workflow without high performance computing, and very lucky to be so close to Argonne National Lab here, where we have great computing resources. But a lot of these questions involve artificial intelligence and machine learning and so on, and they require, mining on big data sets to do that.
Yeah, I really appreciate, what you're doing transcends what most people, when they're thinking about severe weather that could affect our country, a lot of forecasters aren't really looking farther beyond the Pacific and what's coming in, for a lot of reasons. It's really what our models resolve as well. And you're taking a really global view, and I think it really helps to think about, if you want to go out further in time, you really have to think about the whole planet. That's a lot.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
It's a really lot. And you know what? It's not, these forecasts are not going to change what Amy does, what James does, right? What Kevin does. You're not going to, no homeowner is going to say, 2 weeks from now, I'm not going to change my daily routine just because some guy thinks there's going to be more severe weather in 2 weeks. These products are not tailored for people like that, right? You're not going to change your decision even the day before. You're going to change your decision. You're going to start your decision maybe on the outlook time frame, right? And the watch time frame, mesoscale discussion time frame, and warning. Certainly, you better have everything in place. But these forecasts, you got to be really careful with human consumption, because the hype train gets going real quick when storm chasers start to say, "Oh, severe weather in week 2," and then it's, you guys know how this operates on weather Twitter. It's every forecast run of the GFS supercell composite for run after run after run, and then all of a sudden day 1 comes and the mesoscale doesn't look very good. There's no tornadoes. So
tell us about that. This has been going for 5 years. Have you seen these forecasts get co-opted in that way, or has there not been a lot of hype training yet?
There have been a few big events that have been hype trained, and thankfully the forecast worked out in those cases. Otherwise, we'll look pretty foolish. But again, they're interpreted, and it's very difficult, right? Because we're just putting something out there on a web page with not a lot of description, and so you kind of see that, people tack onto it, and then of course it gets spread like wildfire. But have some faith, everybody, knowing that there is some research behind it and some ideas of what we're trying to do and how to make these forecasts better. But again, I think it is important, though, to put our numbers out there and show verification, because otherwise we're just kind of hand waving and saying, hey, everybody, we're forecasting it weeks 2 and 3 and we're skillful. But if we don't provide any of that data, or one thing that I love to do is put our forecast discussion in there. What are we looking at? What do we think is important? And kind of allow people to, sort of like an area forecast discussion that the National Weather Service does in that regard.
Do you work at all with Patrick Marsh or Russ Schneider, or any of these guys at SPC on this product?
This project, not specifically, but I am working with CPC and SPC for their seasonal severe weather outlook, which is issued on March 1st, that looks at the upcoming 3 months. And so I'm hoping, we were unsuccessful this go around with funding, but I'm hopeful next go around that this will be, I think it's obvious, it could be useful for SPC staffing, simple things like that I think could be very beneficial for, but we're going to need to, we got to get some funding to keep pushing this stuff forward, because I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit and a lot of exploratory analysis that needs to be done.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This really does straddle the boundary between 2 of the NCEP centers, between CPC and SPC. As you're starting to break down the timescales, right? You're really being a bridger.
So, Kim, you identify a major problem,
yeah,
right? Which is the funding agencies. Though they look at this, one funding agency likes to look at this as climate, and the other one likes to look at this as weather. And then so we kind of sit in this bridge of purgatory, where we're trying to bridge both of them together, and yet it's not CPC, but it's not SPC. So where is it at, and how do we best describe? It's a really finicky. It's a really finicky research area, but maybe that's why I'm working on it.
I know. Well, maybe this is why we're friends. We're working on things like the probabilistic hazard information to extend warning time. Some of that bleeds into SPC scale, and so there's been some discussion about, in practicality, if we were to implement this, who would own it? Who would do some of this? Should it be at the WFO, or should the SPC be doing it? And those have been active discussions. We have to solve, from an implementation standpoint, this is one of the big challenges in research to operations is, the science can be fine, but that's only one part of the equation. The other part of it is the institutions that we've set up to communicate. And we set them up to, along the lines of the science we had available at the time to describe different kinds of phenomena. As the science advances and we fill in all of these gaps, we're starting to break the institutions. And it's hard. Thinking about how it's actually going to be implemented is and not a small thing. So very interesting to hear that you're actually straddling a very similar, sort of in the next time step institutionally, similar problem. So I want to toss this to John. He has a question. Speaking of this transition to between scales, he's thinking on the climate time scale for his question.
Yeah, both Vic and also to you, Harold. If we accept the premise that one of the hallmarks of climate change is a more highly variable jet stream, and particularly during the tropical season, perhaps even a further north position of the mean jet, which is making these issues of tremendous rainfall from landfalling systems more of a problem. How, in a synoptically driven system that's well behaved, we can do pretty well with extended range forecasts. But if we're dealing with a system that's not well behaved, it's highly variable, how is that complicating this?
Okay.
I will just say
this is why we have you smart guys on here to answer these questions.
By the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but in regards to the extended range forecast with mesoscale driven forcing, so think like once you get into June, upslope flow in Colorado, and really you're not no skill. You're not going to, it's the nature of the forcing for ascent. We're going to be skillful when we have these big systems come out, eject from the plains that are being driven by big upper level lows and so on. And, at least for right now, we're just scratching the surface of skill there. So I don't think there's much hope for, say, June, July, and August, convective storms in the central and northern Great Plains.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. The climate question. Okay. One of the things that I think there have been a few groups of us that have worked on this and come up with similar answers, doing the analysis a little bit different ways. If we restrict our attention to F1 and greater tornadoes, over the last 40 years, the number of days per year with at least one F1 somewhere in the United States has gone from about 150 down to 100. The number of days with, say, 30 or more has gone up from one every other year to two per year. And it turns out that we still have averaged about 500 F1 and stronger tornadoes. I don't know if it's a magic number somehow, but that's 500 on average. So there's no long-term trend in the total count per year. It is my gut tells me that's related to some of the pattern changes and the variability in the jet stream. The problem is I don't have a physical mechanism that goes from the change in the pattern changes the way that tornadoes occur in that direction. I mean, I can believe if we change the pattern, that should have an impact on tornado occurrence. But why should the pattern change in a way that's led to fewer days, but when there's a good day, we get a lot more, and typically it's over a bigger area. Yep. And until we can figure that problem out, it's really hard to go on to that next question that you're asking about what's going to happen when we try to use this in extended range forecasting, because I just don't have a physical mechanism that explains that relationship yet. And that's probably on the climate change time scale, that's probably the single biggest question that we face is, have the pattern changed in the past? I'd love to go back, and when I first did the initial back in 2003, 2002, did the first guess at the global distribution of severe thunderstorms from reanalysis data. That was sort of a swing for the fences with a gambling on a data set working, and it turned out to work spectacularly well. Well, we want to try another one of those, looking at what's called the 20th century reanalysis, which actually has information back to about 1850, and try to figure out a way to quantify patterns and say, has the frequency of these really good patterns or bad patterns, depending on how you want to look at them, either way, changed? We know that the second half of April 2011 was an incredibly big time period for tornadoes in the United States, even before we had April 27th. It was still, without April 27th, the second half of April would have been the biggest period of the last 50 years. Sure. And then you put April 27th on top of it. You go back and you look prior to that, and there are periods like the second part of May 1917, was ridiculously active. Kim mentioned the St. Louis tornado history, and I was looking up the 1896 tornado in the newspapers, and you look for the 2 weeks before that, and every day there's a story about a significant tornado hitting someplace. From May 15th on through May 26th, there's some big tornado or major flash flood event that takes place basically every day. I'd love to know what the pattern looked like for the second half of May 1896. And the only data set we have that remotely gives us a prayer of getting it is this 20th century reanalysis. It may not work, but it's our only shot at it. I want to try to do some things to calculate how often and what do these favorable patterns look like if we look at this over a century time scale. And that may tell us something about the patterns. It changes in the long run.
I think version 3 of that data set is about to come out, Harold.
I keep hearing that rumor any day now. It may be coming out while we're talking now. Yes, and I've got someone down the hall from me who I believe will start to do some analysis on it, probably within about 3 to 4 seconds of it being made available. I assume she has something wired to her alarm clock that if it gets released in the middle of the night, she'll be told so she doesn't waste any time. Yeah.
Wow, that is fascinating, and I think very, very interesting part of your work. When you're looking at the climatology, you can maybe mark change and not know why, and that is a distinct set of changes. Very, very strong signal of something.
Yeah, and one of the things I would, to be honest with you, when I think about history of weather in this country, there are big events that we know. One of the things I really want to know, I'd like to understand 1927 better. 1927, some part of the Mississippi River system was in flood from New Year's Day until like July. Huge amounts of rain. It's the only year in the record in tornadoes since we have more than 500 fatalities, but yet there's not a single tornado that kills 100 people. There were a bunch of pretty bad tornadoes without having a single ridiculous catastrophe that takes place, which is usually how we get the big numbers. I would love to know more about that year. What in the world would James Spann's grandfather have done on television? That year with he would have forget that not sleeping, not being up from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. That would have been be up the whole month of the whole year, weeks without sleep. Yeah.
I one of the things I've enjoyed so much about my time in Oklahoma is I learned early on in my graduate years that stuff just kind of happens sometimes that is really weird. And I think it's just we didn't get the same kinds of convective regime, the same kinds of convection, I should say, that Oklahoma experiences. But in 2007, what you're talking about just reminds me of my experience that summer when out of 90 days, I think we only didn't get rain 12 of them. And what happened was there was this MCS, this nocturnal MCS that set up night after night. And we had these extremely strong thunderstorms. It became tropical. It was so tropical in fact that Tropical Storm Aaron, when it made landfall and came up through Texas into Oklahoma, actually regenerated its eye over land. In August of that year, and that was a stunning event. But that Patrick Marsh, you mentioned him earlier, now at the Storm Prediction Center, when he was a grad student and that happened, he did some research on it and found it to be just there was a process that was built into it. We were under a ridge of high pressure for a good deal of that summer. But it was a self-regenerating mesoscale complex that just day after day there'd be heating and it would come back, and it was kind of one of those darn things. So that has to be kind of a foil a bit if we're trying to think about what you're discussing. How do you treat these years where there's weird things that happen? Can you take something to be generalizable from it, or is it one of those darn things that has to be really hard?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I've thought for a long time that one of the, from the tornado climatology standpoint, I'd love to understand, the late 80s in general were on, what's referred to as the Great Tornado Drought. We just didn't, there just wasn't much that happened for a few years there. And what did happen happened way outside of typical season or locations. So like the Saragossa, Saragossa, Texas, in the far southwest Texas in May of '87. What the heck is that? Is happening there? But there are these other. Is that? We've had a period recently of several years without a whole lot of significant tornadoes in the U.S. And I think those are understanding those extended periods and why they occur would go a long way to understanding understanding how the atmosphere works. Which is a big thing.
This is purely subjective, but one thing that I have noticed over the last 5 years or so, even going back 2013, one of the major North American sort of semi-permanent features has been this ridge over the Gulf of Alaska, and really even into Western Canada, driving northwest flow into the central part of the country and a big Hudson Bay vortex. It seems like we default back to these patterns. They've been, somewhat of the cause of very cold winters in the Northeast and Midwest for some of those years. That I don't know if that's driven by Gulf of Alaska SSTs or if it's a chicken and egg problem, but there does seem to be, when you compare these years to historical years in reanalysis, one thing that pops out is a big ridge in Western Canada and up into the Gulf of Alaska, and the jet structure is just highly amplified and blocked up. And why is that happening for so many years in a row? Yeah. Those are questions. Yeah, not sure, but it is something of notice subjectively. I have to probably go back and do more analysis on it. But
yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John just raised a point as we were talking about, looking at Harold. You were talking about, there's some of these interesting years and how they've unfolded. He's raised a point about some of this is the meteorology, what we're observing.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it is society. Can you talk about that a little bit? That there are underlying changes in things like the distribution of rural populations that can play into that, and in what's observed and recorded, and in the impacts.
Yeah, it can be hard to compare when we go back over a really long period of time because population densities change so much, and basically, I think there's some evidence that 1925, 1927 is when some notion of public awareness began. That's when we started prior to 1925
tri-state.
Well, yeah,
right.
I'm not part of it's tri-state, part of it's I think St. Louis in 1927. Both happen in there because there are rumors that there started being discussion of storm spotters in the St. Louis area after the 27 tornado. And St. Louis is the big city close to tri-state, to where it was the place that there were people who actually got put in the hospital in St. Louis from the tri-state tornado. There were injuries, to where it was still kind of a St. Louis tornado in some sense. But that prior to 1925, the average death rate per million people in the U.S. for each year was about 1.8 deaths per year per million people in the U.S. That was the death rate. And it drops by an order of magnitude over the roughly 60 years after 1925. And we don't really understand what happened. I mean, we've got radio that can help communicate. We've got potentially maybe greater coverage of things. My sort of, and Kim, we talked about doing this project and it didn't happen, so we have to go work on it for this summer or next fall. A project to look at how newspaper coverage changed. When you look at really old newspaper coverage, like the New York Times in particular, is sort of it's around long enough that you can see what it was doing for lots of events. You look in prior to the tri-state tornado, and there are a lot of the stories almost read like the finger of God hit this town, and this town was hit, and people died, and this other town got hit, and people died. And in tri-state, you get the notion of a path, and there were questions raised within just a few days in the newspaper about the fatalities. The 200 fatalities in Murfreesboro, Illinois, happened more than an hour and a half after the first fatalities, and people saying, why aren't we telling people downstream that these things are coming? And so I think there starts to be a completely different notion of what a tornado is that starts to come in there. And that's something, like I said, Kim and I have talked about trying to get together with a journalism school or something and having somebody look at how coverage changed.
Yeah, you can analyze linguistics now.
Yeah, linguistics,
right?
and it's not completely accurate, but there's actually a map of tri-state soon afterwards in newspapers, and there's a map of the path of the 1927 St. Louis tornado in the New York Times the next day, showing what part of town it went through, and that's having paths that didn't just have points on them is different than what you see even just 10 years earlier. So I'd like to really know if that's just my, bad sample, or if really we had a collective change in how we think about tornadoes.
Mm-hmm.
We got to stop, Kim. I'm sorry. We're coming up on, we've been here an hour and 10 minutes, and we've kept Harold and Victor longer than we told them we're going to keep them. So we need to yeah, and Harold's got to go to sleep here. So we kind of need to wrap this up. But I got to ask, but before we let these guys go, my concern, and I don't know if you guys know what happened down here on March 3rd.
Oh, yeah.
We had an EF4 tornado that killed 23 people in Lee County, and 19 of the 23 lived in mobile homes, manufactured homes, whatever. What do we do? Is the science good enough, Harold and Victor, for some type of intermediate product? Because I'm not going to go tell somebody that lives in a mobile home to go sit in a community shelter for 8 hours during a tornado watch. It's horribly uncomfortable. People act weird. They smell weird. You don't want to sit in those things for 8 hours. But yet maybe they'll sit in them for an hour or so. Is the science good enough for some type of intermediate product between a watch and a warning to give them a clue to go to a shelter that might be 10 miles away? These mesoscale discussions, these MCDs from SPC have really been good lately. Is that what it needs to key on, or are we that good? What do we do about this problem? I just had to ask while you guys were here, and the same for you, Kim, all of our PhD people here.
Okay.
Well,
go ahead, Victor. Yeah, no,
okay,
Victor.
I'll start really quick just with the MCDs. So interesting thing, MCDs are actually supposed to usually come out before a watch is issued, in the sense that the environment's becoming favorable and we're going to issue a watch by 2122Z. Now, they can be used to give status updates, and they have been. And you saw this on March 3rd, and some very good storm scale discussions.
Really good. Yeah.
Very good, right? Not even mesoscale anymore. We're talking about singular storm, environment. And perhaps rating this thing because we have so much information. Can there be a product? Yes. I don't know if the mesoscale discussion is that product. I think initiation of people to those shelters probably makes most sense in the watch phase. But how you communicate when to go, what side of the box you're on, you just discussed earlier this week if people can't find themselves on a map still. So we have to be able to communicate that you're in this part of the watch, you can go at this time, this part of the watch, this time. I think the watch for at least folks in mobile homes makes the most sense at this time. Can there be a product in the future that addresses this time window between the watch and the warning? Maybe. But boy, then you have the issue of, maybe you go to the shelter for the first round of storms. Do you leave? What if there's storms behind that line, right? And the watch is extended. There's some really challenging things to think about with getting folks at least out of weak frame housing stock and into shelter. And I don't know what the answer is. I'm not going to pretend I do, but.
Yeah. And we're also experimenting on a slightly different time scale with experimental products that might say might be able to say things in the morning that says, you're going to be under threat, early this afternoon, this evening, overnight, and be able to give you some longer range lead time of a more specific time frame of sort of on something that would look like kind of on the watch time length, but be able to tell you, okay, you need to be paying attention, in your region, late afternoon, early evening, or midnight to 4 a.m. And I'm not sure, and I think there's some communication opportunities with those things that could help people in planning, and sort of lead the way in that. But these are really hard questions. I mean, this is tough stuff.
Right. And Kim, what do you say? I mean, you came down here, the problem. What do we do now? Or do we do anything? Or are we that good?
It's tough stuff. I think the kinds of stuff that we saw coming out of SPC that day were an excellent indication of our technical capabilities. One of the things that I'm interested in is the ability for us as a communication system to actually convey all of that somehow. So by the time that came out, James, did you see the MCD before you were on air already? So I'd be interested in knowing if that's going to be the case. Is there a way is there a mechanism to get this to communicators so it can go out to people?
Those MCDs have gotten so good. I watched them like a hawk. And we saw that very clearly with the storm coming out of Montgomery County, and that MCD came out. And again, that tornado was not in my TV market. It's in the Montgomery TV market. But I thought those guys did a wonderful job of taking that MCD and running with it. But again, we had that loss of life. And I'm thinking, dadgummit, we knew that you go back and look at that. We knew it. And so what did we do wrong in communicating the message, and what can we do better? And it's partly physical science and it's partly social science. And that's the struggle we have. I think the one thing, Harold and Victor, we can say down here in Dixie Alley, we have more trailers than you do.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. When I'll ask you, James. I mean, let's say we come up with a product that you're in a watch. There's a warning, perhaps 2 counties to your west, and so we're going to create a little box on the extended edge of this warning, sort of what probabilistic warning looks like. These swaths. I mean, you might go on and tell people that, but in the end, are they actually going to go to shelter? I don't know.
Right. But I think we can be very specific and say, if you live in a manufactured home, you go to a shelter now. And typically what I just say on television when a warning is issued, you can't be in a mobile home. You can't be in a car. Well, what good does that do if your lead time is 4 minutes and the shelter's 10 minutes away? Yeah. That doesn't do much good. It sounds nice for me to say that. That's the right thing to say. But what good does it do when you're living in a manufactured home in a rural area by yourself? It's not a trailer park. And again, the shelter's 10, 15 miles away, or a truck stop, or some place that's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The typical lead time we provide in a warning is not good enough. So if we had that product, Victor, I would be very bold and say, if you live in a manufactured home in this defined area, now is the time you go to a shelter. Yeah. And
I would say we don't have that now, right? And so the best solution right now is to probably say, let's take action for those folks who live in weak frame housing stock. Let's take action during the watch stage. And I know it's 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours that you don't want to be sitting there, but let's be honest. If we don't have a product that's going to fill that need, then let's use what we have now. And the best of what we have now, I would say, would be doing that at the watch stage. Not everybody has to do that, right? It's going to be the folks that are in weak frame housing stock. And you can say that on air and say, if you were in a mobile home, now's the time we are under a tornado watch to be thinking about what you're going to do and how much time you need to get to shelter and so on and so forth.
I think I've just got to be better at messaging during this kind of stuff. But we've got to take a break because I've got to go. So Aubrey, have you got time for email? Thumbs up, thumbs down?
I've got like 1 minute.
Okay, we don't have time. We'll do email next week. So what I'm going to do, Kim, I'm going to roll Tony Rice, and Kim, I'll be gone when we come back to go do the television. So you pick it up after this. Let's take a break for Tony Rice. We've got much more to come as WeatherBrains rolls along.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your astronomy outlook.
The Lyrid meteor shower is underway with an anticipated peak early this week. Now, normally, the advice to maximize the number of meteors that you might see is to go outside about an hour or two before sunrise. This is when the Earth is rotating into the stream of dust and rock left behind by the comet or asteroid that hosts this yearly fireworks show. But not this year. To see the meteors, you need to avoid the nearly full moon that rises about 11:30 p.m. local time and doesn't set until after sunrise. Even then, the radiant, or the point where the meteors appear to be radiating from, will be so low on the horizon, for most of us, it's going to hide about half of the area where meteors are likely to be seen. So, I wouldn't expect more than a meteor or two at most to be seen from this moderate, poorly placed meteor shower this year. You may have seen some articles on the Lyrid meteor shower suggesting up to 18 meteors per hour. I'll just be nice and call those ill-informed. The number being used there is the ZHR. And this is a formula that's not to be used for estimates, but for handicapping observations made from different places around the world. It represents the absolute most that you might be able to see. Now, I've ranted about this before, but hear me out. ZHR, or zenith hourly rate, is a formula that takes the number of meteors that were actually seen by an observer and then normalizes it by accounting for things like clouds, obstructions on the horizon, light pollution, as well as how low on the horizon that radiant appears. Its purpose is to compare apples to apples in observations, but it's too often used as an estimate for the number of meteors that might be seen, and it shouldn't be. It's way too high for all but a very small number of places on Earth that are not only very, very dark with perfectly clear skies, but also perfectly placed for that particular shower. But we've got another shower to look forward to, the Eta Aquariids, which peak the night of May 4th into May 5th. This is happening just as the moon turns new, which will make for a much better show. Rates of about 10 to as many as 30 meteors per hour in really dark skies are expected, and there's activity anticipated throughout the week. That's your Astronomy Outlook. Follow me in RTP Hokie for more spacey stuff like this.
All right, and we're back. So we're going to be skipping our email. We'll come back for that next week, Aubrey. But now let's do some weather roundup. We have a really interesting system about to affect a good bit of the country. I think we might have just lost Vic too. Harold, are you able to stick around to offer a pick of the week?
I am going to stick around pick of the week time, yes.
Great. Well, let's hop into the picks. If you want to know what's going to happen with the weather, there's a lot of things you can consult. A lot of rain about to happen. I'll just summarize. It's going to rain. It's going to rain. So, Harold, let's go to you first. Give us your pick of the week.
I'm going to do two. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I'm cheating. Yeah. Well, James left, so I figure I could take his. One of them, I spent Saturday at the Oklahoma, Kansas Judgment and Decision Making Workshop, listening to people talk about making decisions under uncertainty with great time pressure. One of the big focuses this year for that group was confidence. And especially on things like police shooting actions, and what does a police officer do? Is really some incredibly neat stuff, and I'm hoping we can train some of those people into our decision making under uncertainty problems. The second one I hadn't been thinking about, but since it came up, 1927, I think everybody involved in meteorology and hazards ought to read a book called Rising Tide by John Barry. I think I gave it to Kim at some point in her life to read. It's a history of the 1927 flood and all of the societal impacts that flood had. It's what led to Herbert Hoover becoming president. Was his work on the recovery efforts after that. It led to large migrations of African Americans into Chicago. And so it has a huge impact both in terms of the meteorology and everything that went on, but then also into the impacts on society. So that's a Rising Tide by John Barry. Everyone should read that. Excellent. Thank you. John, do we have a pick of the week for you?
Oh, absolutely. I actually had three, but I think I'll just go with one. This was an update that came from NOAA in the last week, upgrading Hurricane Michael to a Category 5 at landfall. So only the fourth, since we've been keeping track of this, only the fourth Category 5 to hit mainland United States.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, big news. It looks like we've just lost Kevin walking around the studio a bit. All right, we'll go to you, Vic. Do you have a pick for us?
I do. My pick of the week is the upcoming, and it's not shortly upcoming, but it's in July, 10th through the 12th in Boulder, Colorado. It's an NSF-sponsored workshop called Mind the Gap, and it's going to be focusing on promoting education for the next generation of atmospheric scientists, training them for industry needs. So this is something that the NSF is putting on to bring together academia in the private sector to discuss issues of curriculum and readiness and how we can better train students to deal with things like big data sets for future needs in private industry. And so it should be a really nice mix of private and hopefully government and academic sectors coming together to identify some gaps and recommendations that we can hopefully provide to AMS and their education committee. And it's opened really just like any other workshop to the atmospheric science sector. And what a better place to be than, early July in Boulder.
Yeah, I know that that's actually a pastime of Oklahomans to find some excuse to leave the state in July and get up to Colorado. So that's great. Thank you. And I'll wrap up with my pick. It's just a WPC product, so bringing another NCEP center into the conversation. I've really enjoyed this product. It just came out the last couple of years. Reflects Storm Prediction Center convective outlooks. They have rainfall outlooks, and it basically tells the story of it's going to rain. So if you want to consult that link and click through the next couple days, you'll get a sense for how this system is about to stall, and the South Central Plains are about to have some fun with the water from the sky. With that, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Harold, we'll let you get to bed.
That's much appreciated. Yes, much appreciated.
Yep. A great conversation.
Awesome.
Thank you all so much for joining us. And thanks for the questions, panelists. We'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks, all.
Thanks, Kim. Harold, Vic, thank you so much. Fantastic.
Val, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Good time. Good
This
time.
is great. Yep. Bye-bye.
Yep.
Good night, guys.
Bye.
Okay. That was a great show. Oop, my mic's falling off here. Great to have Harold and Victor on the show with us this week. I want to go back and listen to that whole thing again in the parts I didn't hear, but those guys are wonderful. They are researchers that offer real clear communication to us practitioners down here, the grunts that do the work, at our level. And really appreciate those guys being on the show this week. But got to do some weather on the TV side. Thank you guys for watching. Have a great week. We'll see you next Monday night. Have a great weekend. God bless. Bye-bye.